The Upper Cumberland Extension teams, we put together one of these a month. And tonight's topic is managing your timber in Tennessee. We call this the Ag Talk Tuesday. And we have with us tonight Dr. David Mercker, and he is going to walk us through how to market your timber in Tennessee. We're going to leave some time at the end for some questions. If you've got any questions, just jot them down, or David might want you to, or Dr. Mercker might want you to just jump in. But anyway, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mercker.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I'm Dr. David Mercker. I am a forestry specialist with the University of Tennessee. I've been at this job about 23 years. Prior to that, I had 13 years experience with the consulting forestry firm up in the state of Indiana. And so my job is to travel this great state and to teach, and some would say preach, forestry to anyone who has ears. And so that could include a group of landowners like tonight virtually. Tomorrow it could be a group of master gardeners in Memphis. And last Saturday it was over in Greenville where I gave a presentation as well. So basically anybody with ears is potential audience, including youth. So it's a pleasure to be here. I will do my best to practice the 5 B's of public speaking, and that is be brief, brother, be brief. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. Timber marketing makes the difference. I want to begin with a very profound statement. If you remember nothing else about this evening, please remember this. You don't make money growing trees, you make money selling them. Now, before advising you on what to do this evening, I want to share some quick points on what you don't want to do when you're selling timber. And we begin with simply by saying, don't get in a hurry. It takes your trees decades to grow, to reach financial maturity. And I see people sell them on a whim overnight. And that's something that can be very difficult to live with if you've done it wrong, because it takes decades and decades to overcome that. Secondly, I don't really encourage you to sell your timber direct. Normally, we're going to recommend that you use a professional forester. These are people that have 4-year degrees and they understand forest management, forest ecology, silviculture, soils, water, wildlife. They've been trained in a number of disciplines. And so work with a professional forester. Thirdly, then, normally we don't encourage landowners to sell the timber on shares. Now, what I mean by that is that's a situation where the trees are cut down, they're hauled to a mill, and then the logger would come back and share a portion of the check with you. You just want to be careful doing it that way. Sometimes it makes sense if the trees are really poor quality and there's no other way of selling them, but on really good quality trees, that's probably not advisable. And then finally, certainly we don't encourage that you sell your timber on a diameter limit cut. And I'll explain that as we go along, but essentially it means selling trees just because they've reached a certain diameter without a lot of regard to, the vigor of the tree, the species of the tree, the site that the trees are growing on. So as I advance through this evening, largely my experience is with hardwood timber. And so you'll maybe see that bent as we go through it a little bit. But many of these principles apply to pine management as well, marketing pine. So here's an outline. Quickly, what I'm going to be covering this evening. We begin with seeking professional help, and I'll explain the different types of foresters. It's good to have a plan when you sell your timber, when you manage your forest land. And so have a forest management plan, something that has continuity, can be passed down maybe through the generations, so that you're not harvesting timber just on a whim. Have a plan which includes a time frame. Identify your property boundaries. The penalty is triple damages. Double damages if you sell somebody else's trees accidentally. It's triple damages if it's intentional. So you wouldn't want somebody selling your trees, and you need to acknowledge that as well when you're selling your own trees. It's good to have an inventory and appraisal. That's a very important part of selling your timber, and we'll explain that. We want to solicit sealed bids, try to get wide exposure to your trees when you're selling them. Prepare a contract. monitor the logging, and then finally, I'll just touch a little bit on timber taxes. Now, all of this is available in greater detail in a publication that I developed a few years back called Marketing Timber in Tennessee. And so if you just Google that title, Marketing Timber in Tennessee, and maybe my last name, Mercker, you'll find it online. Also, your county agents can get you hard copies of this. It's available through our mail supply room or through me for that matter. So let's begin this, and we're going to begin by seeking the advice of a professional forester, and I like to say, and perhaps several foresters. And so you can find lists of professional foresters either by going through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. They have a website that lists professional foresters in the state, consulting foresters. Of course, there are state foresters as well. And then your local county extension agent, oftentimes they have a list or at least know of foresters that work the region. So begin with a professional forester, and here's two locations where you might be able to find your forester. Now, there are different types of professional foresters, so let me explain them. We have the state area forester. This is with the Tennessee Department of Forestry. These are foresters that typically serve anywhere from about 3 to 5 counties. Their primary responsibility is forest fire control. They also oversee cost share programs, both federal and state, for tree planting and timber stand improvement and things like that to help defray expenses that landowners might have. And then also state area foresters can develop forest management plans for you. Their services are free, but that also means that their services are limited because they have to serve so many people. And so I like to say that it's a good start. Get a hold of the area forester, have them inspect your property and get their advice and recommendations. Oftentimes then they will turn you over to a consulting forester. Consulting foresters are independently employed. And so they work for landowners, helping them practice forest management, which includes selling your timber, planting trees, doing timber stand improvement appraisals, and the like. Typically, when they help you sell your timber, they will work on a commission basis. And normally that's a 10% commission, but it does float. And they'll handle the process from A to Z, turnkey, and oftentimes that's a good way for landowners to go. Now, the forest industry, also some of them employ professional foresters as well. And so they have degrees in forestry too. But their primary responsibility is wood procurement to the mill. And so you just want to keep that in mind. But there's some really good industry foresters out there that can help you get started. So before you sell your timber, it's very important that you establish your goals. Why do you own your land? And goals can be as varied as the landowners that own the land. But generally, in a minimum, we're concerned about what I call the 4 W's, which is wood, water, wildlife, and recreation. These are the primary reasons why people own their land, their forest land. And your forester can help you establish these goals and then recommend some objectives, some action steps to help you achieve your goals. And all this is summarized in a forest stewardship plan. Now, a stewardship plan also is the key oftentimes that allows you to qualify for cost share programs to implement on your property. So before the government's going to turn loose of funds, they want to make sure that you've got a plan step by step on how you wish to move forward. So keep that in mind. A plan is very important. So assuming you've located a forester and you've kind of established your goals and have at least some kind of a plan, whether it's general or very formal, now you're ready to begin the process of identifying and marking your property boundaries. Can't say enough about that. Typically, and initially you might use something like ribbons to help identify where the line is until you know for sure. But then in time, you want to make something a little more substantial, lasting, like paint marks or perhaps even signs. Work with your neighbor. If you can't agree, that's where a survey has to come in. But it's not always as clear as you might think. People oftentimes argue over lines, And so you've got to get that straight. So assuming you've done all that, now you're ready to begin the process of selecting the trees and marking them for sale. And so, as Chris was alluding to earlier, it's very important to designate which trees are to be sold. Now, again, I'm talking about hardwood stands, not pine. You wouldn't necessarily mark the trees in a pine stand, but in hardwoods, because they're such high value, you want to mark them with highly visible paint, and we like to mark them twice on chest high on each side of the tree, normally with a band, and then also at the very base of the tree, you would put a spot. And the purpose of that spot at the base, that represents your receipt. So when the bidders come in and look at your trees, because they've been marked, everybody's bidding on the same trees, and that's important, rather than somebody saying, well, I took all the oak and I took them just 16 inches and bigger and so forth. And you're not comparing apples with apples. But when the forester has designated the trees that are for sale, then there's no question about it, which ones are for sale. Now, in the process of selecting your hardwood trees to sell, you don't want to high grade your forest. And this is a practice that's not acceptable. High grading is harvesting that removes the most valuable trees and leaves a stand of undesirable, low value trees. So in other words, you're going to take the best and leave the rest. And some people might think that's a good thing. Well, I just sold a few number of trees and got the highest value, and the forest still looks good. The problem is you've left the inferior trees, what I like to call the D trees, diseased and damaged and dwarfed and duds and dying and dastardly and otherwise just undesirable trees. And you wouldn't think about doing that with your livestock, just harvesting the best sow and keeping the inferior one. But people do it with trees all the time. So you want to be careful with that. Remember, harvesting your timber is not only an opportunity to generate some revenue, but it's also an opportunity to improve the forest, overcoming the mistakes of the past. And so while they're in there getting the desirable trees, you need to take out some of the undesirables too. So remember, our goal might be a stand on the left, but oftentimes a stand on your right is the reality. And that's what happens when you have repetitive high grading year after year, through the generations anyway. Now, I want to pause just a second and address this question. Is there cause for alarm in Tennessee? Are we overcutting our timber? Let me just say we've got about 14 million acres of forest land in Tennessee. In the year 1900, we had about 9.1 million acres. So we've essentially gained 5 million acres of forest land in the last 120 years. I'll let that sink in a little bit. Yeah, we've gained 5 million acres, about 53% increase in the amount of forest land in this state. And for the last word in that, go back and look at Civil War photographs and study the landscape. And you notice how devoid the landscape was of trees at that time. We had cleared and overcleared in the name of progress, but also because we needed the wood to develop our nation before we had fossil fuels and other products that could substitute for wood. It was used for everything. It was said of log cabins that each year the cabin would burn more wood than it took to build the cabin. So we were very hard on it. But since then, the onset of fossil fuels, plastic, things like that has taken pressure off of our wood or of our forest land. And so our hardwood timber volume is increasing, but according to the U.S. Forest Service, the quality is decreasing. And that's because we've done kind of a disfavor by high grading the forest through the years. So the question you might have is, well, why is the timber quality decreasing? Well, I've mentioned high grading, again, taking the best and leaving the rest. So here's a photograph right here that I took shortly after coming to Tennessee. And this is a recently harvested forest, but I want you to notice what was left. Here's an example. If you can see this tree, it's crooked, it's hollow at the base. And some people say, well, it's only worth $5. I want to leave it. Well, okay, let's leave it for 15 to 20 years and it's worth $10. In other words, if it's even still alive at that point, if it hasn't blown over. So this is a type of tree that I'm talking about when I say, if you're going to take those jewels and those gems out, the ones that are ready for market, we want to be sure to weed your forest at the same time and take out trees like that. Even the tree next to it, if you look at it from a different angle, you can see what they've done here. Don't do that. This is a forked tree. Don't take one and leave the other. That stump's just going to rot, and that tree, if it doesn't blow over, it certainly will stain, because that will cause fungi to come into that tree and discolor the wood. So we don't want to do that. But it's not just the condition of the tree. There's certain species that are just low value trees. I've just picked one here, hackberry. And so we don't want to leave these types of trees in your forest. Remember, logging is an opportunity to overcome the mistakes of the past and to weed your forest. And so there's a whole host of trees that are considered kind of low value. I've just picked on hackberry, but there's box elder, sycamore, cottonwood, locust, and a whole host of others. So again, getting back to the question, why is timber quality decreasing? The second reason is that diameter limit cutting. So I've mentioned that already, but it's simply, it's the indiscriminate practice, if I can preface it, it's the indiscriminate practice of only using diameter as the criteria for the trees that you're going to harvest. Now, the problem with that is each species grows at a different rate and has a different value. And so if we just harvested, say, for instance, oak trees that are 16 inches and bigger, in many cases, they really haven't reached their financial maturity, depending on the site, until they're 22 or 24, or if you're down in the river bottoms, maybe even 28 or 30 inches in diameter. And so when you compare that to a half-grown steer, we don't take half-grown steers to the market. We want to fatten that steer up. And so, but in contrast, there may be some undesirable trees like the hackberry that I mentioned, that we would want to get it out at 16 inches or 14 or 12, get it out of the woods. So let me show you an example here. This is a forest, and you can see kind of array of species there and different qualities, and some are crooked and some are forked and so forth. And if you just did a diameter limit cut on this stand and took all the trees that were roughly 16 inches and bigger, I want you to notice what would be left. Can you see what we've done? We've definitely high graded this stand if you take a look at what's left. And so this stand doesn't have a lot of potential to it. A truth be known, they should have taken all these. If they're going to do a diameter limit cut, you might as well have clear cut it. So let's go back to that stand. And this time we use a forester, and the forester is going to select some trees that are mature. They're ripe for picking, but at the same time, let's get some of those D trees out that I talk about, disease and damage and dwarfed and so forth. And then once they're gone, take a look at the stand. We've actually improved the stand by avoiding a diameter limit cut. So I've even written a publication on this. It's called Sustainable Forestry versus Diameter Limit Cutting, that explains it more. But I'm on a mission to minimize this method of harvesting timber in Tennessee, because this is what's leading to the degradation of our forest land. So why is timber quality decreasing? There you have it. So let's talk about some harvest methods for Tennessee hardwoods. And there's more than what I can cover here this evening, but these are the acceptable methods. And I'm going to begin by something that's maybe harsh to many of you, but a clear cut actually is an acceptable method of managing hardwood timber in the state, if it's ready for it, if it's needed. And what I mean by that, some of these stands have been high graded so poorly that they don't have much potential left. And so you simply have to start them over. Let's regenerate it and try to get something up and started. Also, clear cutting is good when you've got a situation where the stand is simply mature. The trees have reached their financial maturity, and it's time to start over. Now, this method might not be acceptable for everybody, and it certainly isn't acceptable for small landowners, particularly if you recreate on your land. You have 30 acres, you're probably not going to clear cut it, but it's nothing for somebody with 1,000 acres to clear cut 50 acres. And so it's just good for bringing back the forest and great for wildlife habitat. If you're a self-respecting turkey that's trying to hide your poults, as that young forest is growing back, that's perfect for them. Or if you're a doe that's trying to nourish 2 fawns, it's a great place to hide your fawns, and there's plenty for you to reach and eat as the trees begin to grow back. So that's one method that's acceptable. Another method that a lot of people like is this single tree selection. Now, they like it because it looks good when it's done. And so typically we're only harvesting 10 to maybe 15 trees per acre. The problem with it is that if it's not done right, it becomes high grading, and that's not what we want to do. Remember, we talked about getting the undesirable trees out while you're in there. And also a trade-off is that if you continually implement single tree selection in your forest, it will tend to favor the regeneration of shade tolerant trees. So here's what I mean by that. Maple and beech and dogwood and hickory and ash and a few others are tolerant to shade. So they get started. We never get openings big enough to get a good splash of sunlight down to the forest floor. And so because these openings are so small, the sun-loving trees don't have a good chance to flourish, like tulip poplar, to a certain extent oak, certainly pine if you're trying to grow pine. So that's a trade-off. It looks good, but it can change the composition of your forest in time. So another harvest method that some people implement then is group selection. So what this essentially is, I like to just think of it as small pockets of clear cuts. And so essentially what you're doing is you're creating openings that are about 1 to maybe 5 or 10 acres in size, and you're clear cutting them, but in the balance of the forest, you leave it alone. And so that gives you this opportunity to get that blast of sunlight down to the forest floor to create great habitat for wildlife, but yet you still have roughly 80% of your forest that's left intact. But the problem is that it takes a long time to go through this because you're going to repeat it on about 15 to 20 year intervals. And if you're following through time, it's going to take about 60 years to actually go through the entire forest to do it. So that brings me to the final method of harvesting. And this is the one that I'm most fond of for smaller landowners. And that's a combination of single tree selection with group selection. So we go ahead and make these openings that you see there, but then we come in the balance of the forest and we cut it lightly, doing improvement work on it, taking out those crooked trees, the defective trees. There'll be some that are mature that need to come out too, but it still is kind of a lighter impact. It allows you to have these openings that are good for wildlife, starting the forest back. And so that's a trade-off. Now, I want to show you, clear cut gets a bad rap. There's no question about it. We learn about it in forestry school as one of the tools. What you're looking at is a forester in West Tennessee at the Chickasaw State Forest a number of years ago. That's Roy Ward. And he had made his first clear cut, and here it was. And of it, he said it was big, it was ugly, and it was mine. And so he had to deal with it. But I want to point something out. Can you see this clear cut's about 3 years old after it was clear cut. So it's beginning to grow back. You can notice there's a stump, and he's holding a sprout coming off that stump. So there's the forester, there's the stump, and there's the sprout. Now watch very closely as I go through this. And we're not done. And we're still not done. The forest is resilient. The forest is resilient. The forest is resilient. You just have to be patient. We've gone from this to this in 35 years, and I took 3 of those 4 pictures. So the forest does bounce back. It takes a long time, but because we had a good blast of sunlight, look at the stand of timber that's grown up behind it. Straight, tall, fighting for sunlight, and that's exactly what you want, are trees that have good length to them, shading off those lower branches to make some good clean lumber. Well, let's continue on, make some progress with the presentation. And now we're going to talk about inventorying your timber. And so your foresters, as he or she selects the trees for sale and measures them and marks them, they're going to provide you with a summary of what's to be sold. And so here's an example of what you might see. And so you'll see the species listed in the first column. The second column is how many trees of that particular species were marked. The third column is the board foot volume. Now, board foot is a piece of wood that's 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. So 144 cubic inches. Foresters can measure the diameter of the tree and the number of logs, and then we have tables that help us determine how many board feet is in each tree. And so you would get a summary of this from your forester. I don't know if you can see my cursor, I guess you can. And then the far right column is the average volume per tree. And this happens to be in the Doyle rule. In our region, it's the most common rule that's used. It's actually not the most accurate, but it is the one that's most commonly used. The international quarter inch is the one that's most accurate. It's, if you want to communicate with the wood industry, this is the one you use. Now, what I want to point out here, a few things. They're in descending order by the most volume. So you can see most of the volume is in red oak. That's a high value tree. Poplar is a high value tree. Of course, white oak certainly is. It's the hottest thing in the market right now, and a few others. But if all we did was cut the red oak and the poplar and the white oak out, what would we call that? We'd call that high grading, right? And so while they're in here, we want to pull out some of these smaller hickories and the beech that are typically low value, and some of these others. And you notice some of these other species, we've taken them down to a smaller size. So we're letting the oak reach the maturity size. So there's a lot of trees in here that you could harvest, but they're just not quite ready. But let's get some of these lower value trees out at a smaller diameter. There's sweet gum there to make room for some of the better quality red oak and poplar and white oak that have been left behind for the next sale. And so then here's your summary, number of trees. This is what your timber buyer is going to be looking at. And overall, we've got about a 239 board foot average, which isn't bad. Pretty good sized trees, really. So you've got your inventory, but that in itself isn't enough, because you want to have an estimate of your crop value before selling. And so think about the other farm commodities that you sell. We don't sell corn or livestock based on guesswork. You typically want to know what they're worth before you put them on the market. And so there aren't a lot of sources that can help you determine the value of timber. Probably the best source is your consulting forester's comparables. They're going to know what timber's selling for, this quality trees that ought to average so much, per board foot overall. The sawmills oftentimes will have their own price lists as well, which gives you a general idea. But as I'll explain shortly, this would be for the delivered price, which is not the stumpage price, and I'll define that shortly. Some other sources, there are some forest product bulletin. Some states publish that. Tennessee used to, but they stopped about 5 years ago. And then there are some lumber market reports. I use the hardwood market report out of Memphis, Tennessee. It comes out weekly. But again, it's lumber. It's not the logs, and it certainly isn't standing trees. And so they're kind of confusing to understand how to read these things. So let me help you understand price reporting a little bit better. I've mentioned stumpage price. That's the value of the tree while it is still standing. So as your forester goes out into your woods and measures that tree and puts a price on it, this is what it's worth while it's still vertical. They call that stumpage price. It's what you would be paid for the trees before they're cut down. Now, once they're cut down, then the logger is going to deliver them to the mills. And of course, there's value added there. Loggers have to be paid too, and the truck drivers as well. And so that goes into it. And so as you would expect, the delivered price would be worth more than stumpage price. And then finally, there is lumber value as well. That's, of course, after it's been sawn up. So the value goes up, obviously, as more people touch it and more equipment touches it. So as processing continues. Well, how much is the tree worth? And the answer to that is it depends. It depends on a number of things, as I'll explain shortly. But let me just give you an example. Let's say this is a 22-inch diameter tree, and when we measure trees at diameter at breast height, DBH, so that's 4.5 feet above the ground. For two reasons. It's a convenient height to measure trees, but secondly, it gets you above the trunk flare. There's a swelling at the trunk, and the tree tends to taper out and better represent the log itself. So let's say it's 22 inches in diameter, and it has just 2 logs in it. So it's not a massive tree, but Doyle scale, that tree would have 280 board feet in it. Well, how much is that tree worth? Again, it depends. So here's just some examples. This isn't necessarily the current pricing. I'm just showing you this so that you can see kind of a relative example of what it could be worth. And I begin with hackberry. I'm pretty hard on hackberry. It's a low value tree that nobody really wants. That tree, if it were a hackberry, and that would be a pretty big hackberry to have 280 board feet in it, it still would only be worth about $22 on the stump. This is stumpage price. Now, let's drop down to poplar. Now, it makes a big difference on grade. I haven't defined grade yet, but grade essentially is the quality. And so I talk about form, which is the straightness of the tree. Grade is the number of defects. And so grade number 2 would be a poor quality poplar. Grade number 1 would be a pretty good quality poplar. Not the best, but number 1 is good quality. And you can see what happens, the price differential. I've done the same thing with hickory and white oak, and it's worth much more than that now. Again, these are just examples. And then red oak, and then I've thrown a white oak veneer in there as well. So we've gone from a $22 tree to basically a $500 tree. It's the same size tree, but just different species and different grades. Here's the point. It would take 22 hackberry trees to equal 1 white oak veneer tree. So why do we want to be growing hackberry if we could be growing something higher value? And some people say, well, you're being kind of hard on hackberry and locust and sycamore and so forth. And obviously we need all trees. All trees have some importance. I heard something the other day that a tree, a plant whose you're trying to define a weed. What's a weed? And they said, well, a weed is just a plant whose virtue has not yet been discovered. So we could say the same thing about some of these other species of trees. But having said that, my goal as a forester is to make sure we're going to have forest for the future. How do we do that? How do I achieve that goal? I achieve that goal by making sure landowners are making money when they sell trees. Therefore, they'll want to keep their forested and not convert it to something else. And so if all we're growing is hackberry, eventually people will say, well, let's just clear it and convert it to something else. So that's one of the reasons why I'm prone to growing high value trees. So let me show you a composite price, lumber price. Now, let me go through this title carefully. Composite implies that I'm going to add up these 6 species because these are kind of the main species in Tennessee that are worth a lot of money: red oak, white oak, poplar, cherry, maple, and walnut. It's the lumber price, so it's not the stumpage or the log price. It's lumber. It's been cut up already. And this is from the hardwood market report that I get on a weekly basis. Now, they give you a lot of different prices based on quality and thickness of the board. And so what this is, a number 1 common, just think of that as an average quality board. That's a good board, not the best, but it's average. 4/4 implies that it's 1 inch thick. There are 4 quarters as opposed to 6/4 or 8/4. And what you're about to see is a 16-year summary composite price. So I use this as a barometer. People call up, they say, well, is it a good time to be selling timber? So, well, here's the 6 species. And if you average them all together, this is what it has done over the 16-year history. So I've kind of marked that some of the peaks and valleys out for you, beginning with January 2008. And it's like a heartbeat almost. And you can see where all the recessions occurred. 2007, 2000, that was probably, wait, I got that wrong. That's about 2014 recession and 2018 recession. And we peaked out, of course, this was during kind of the COVID period, the early part of COVID period right there. But look what has happened since we broke loose about a year and a half ago. I've never seen a stretch like this that we've gone through. I mean, that's straight up. Prices for most species moved upward kind of at a feverish pitch. And it's driven by both an increased demand. A lot of houses were being built during that time. A lot of people were home, they were remodeling. And on top of that, the mills were low in inventory because they curtailed. The loggers shut back, the mills shut back, employment shut back. So at a time when demand was high, supply was very low. Supply is now beginning to catch up. And just over the last about 2 to 3 weeks, I'm seeing it taper off. So, is it a good time to sell timber? Yeah, it sure is. I mean, it probably would have been better to sell it right about here while it was still increasing, because now they're going to start getting a little bit nervous. Is it going to start coming down, or is it going to flatline on us? We don't know. It depends on a lot of variables, but prices are extremely high, particularly for white oak, unbelievably high for white oak and walnut. The better grades of poplar are actually higher value than the better grades of red oak right now, although red oak is a high value species. About the only one that's really dropping hard right now is cherry. Cherry's dropping pretty hard. So that gives you an idea and explains to you, maybe another reason why you need to be working with a forester, because they're going to be keeping track of this and can advise you on when's a good time to sell timber. Well, not all tracts of timber are created equal. People sometimes don't understand, Bob sold his timber and got, $100,000, and you're telling me mine's only worth 20,000. I don't understand. Number of things go into. We're going to discuss the factors that affect the stumpage price. So this is the price you would get as a landowner. And I begin with timber size. Can't say enough about that. Big trees bring big bucks. If you've got, $300,000 piece of equipment, you're a logger and you're dragging trees out of the woods, you want to be dragging big trees. Secondly, timber quality. Clean logs are preferred. I think somebody's got their mic on. Timber quality. Clean logs are preferred, and clean means free of defects, knots, lightning strikes, things like that. So just because you have oak doesn't mean it's high value oak. If the stand's been high graded and you've got a bunch of knotty oak, then it won't be worth as much. The amount of volume per acre that's being harvested. So the more, the better. Again, loggers, they're paid on production. And so if they're dragging a lot of trees out and they're big trees, they'll tend to pay more for something like that. Economies of scale. Track access is another one. Is it close to public roads? Does it drain well? Is it sandy? Is a lot of gravel in it? They'll actually pay more for tracts of timber that they can log in the winter, because typically it's hard to log in the winter without causing a lot of ruts and a lot of erosion. So that plays into it. Tract size. Again, this gets back to the economies of scale. I explain it this way. Farmers like big fields. They don't like 2 acre and 5 acre and 10 acre fields. And the same is true of loggers. It's when you get below about 30 acres of hardwoods, it gets more challenging to sell the trees, at least, and get much interest, unless it's just really good trees. I've mentioned the soil conditions. That kind of goes along with the track access. Well-drained soils are preferred. Method of sale plays into it. Seal bids assures competition. And so that's what you want to do. People say, well, how much is the timber worth? I say, well, it really depends. It's kind of like appraising an antique sewing machine until you get people bidding on it. Who knows what that antique sewing machine is going to bring? The harvesting system, I've already mentioned that clear cuts increase production. And so although you might not want to clear cut, sometimes it can help you generate more revenue. Believe it or not, if you're an honorary landowner, that can affect the price that you might get for your timber. Market conditions, as I've already alluded to, and then location in relation to mills. If they have to haul it 60 miles one way versus 20 miles one way, well, in the long run, you're going to pay for that extra hauling cost. So your foresters measure the trees. You've got a summary and you've got an appraisal. You're ready now to advertise and solicit bids. And who do you want to send your sale notice to? Well, here's a list. Master loggers. The Tennessee Forestry Association certifies master loggers. I help teach that course. You certainly want to include them when you're advertising your trees. They're timber buyers and brokers. These aren't the folks that do the logging, but sometimes they're either buying for a sawmill or they're just brokering. Sometimes they'll buy the trees and turn around, pay a logger to log them. And the difference between that is how they get paid. So contact them. Of course, sawmill operators, they may be interested if they're getting low on logs, as well as pulpwood mills, and then veneer buyers if you've got some good quality veneer. The key is, again, you want to get wide exposure. You just never know who wants it, who needs it, who might be working nearby. And boy, that's I can just jump from one job to the next. Get wide exposure. And just because somebody paid the most on one sale, they might be the low bid on the next one. You just never know how it's going to go. Well, once the bids have been opened, then you want to prepare a contract. The University of Tennessee has a sample timber sale contract that you can look at. Your forester is going to have something like this too, your consulting forester. And it just outlines, how the trees are to be paid for, what kind of insurance does the logger have to have, what do the soil conditions have to be like, damage to residual trees, things like that. So it's just good to have a contract. And then also, normally I recommend, now this is with hardwood again, you want to be paid for your trees up front. And so this is where we contrast that buying on shares. You want to be paid before any trees are cut down for the most part. And that's a good thing. You may want to split the payment up. For instance, if you're selling it in November, they're not going to log it till next summer. You might take half in November and the next half, after the first of the year, but certainly before the equipment's unloaded and the trees start coming down, you'd like to have your money. That also puts the risk over to the wood industry if something should happen to the trees, heaven forbid, something like a tornado or wind shear, something like that. But there are some exceptions, though, of getting paid up front. And I've kind of alluded to this. If you've got lower value sale or pulpwood, and they're just not going to pay you for the trees up front, it's so poor quality, or it's pine, they're just going to pay as cut, and that's just the way it operates. Still, it's good to have an inventory so that you might say, well, okay, you'll pay as we go, but we want a guaranteed minimum. We know that it's going to be at least this much. There are some tax advantages when you sell timber, depletion allowance, and that's very important. So shortly after buying your forest land, it's good to have an appraisal very quickly. And the reason is because you've made an investment and you want to know how much of that investment is actually tied up in wood, not the land. And so your forester can tell you the value of those trees. And that way, if you do have tornado damage, you can claim a depletion allowance. Or if you sell timber, you're paying taxes on the growth of the trees after you bought them. And so you can deplete what your initial investment was. And then also timber still is eligible for capital gains, which currently is at a very low rate. It's either 0 or 15%, depending on which tax bracket you're in. Of course, the current proposals are to increase that. And so that may be a reason to sell some timber, before they increase that. That's a decision to be made between you and your accountant. Once they start logging, you want to monitor the logging. That means checking for compliance with the sale conditions. I'll go back to that contract and how it was advertised and what's going to be done. It also means following the best management practices. So BMPs are practices designed to protect the soil and water. Remember that although you own the trees, all the water that passes through the trees is public property. And so you have an obligation to protect their water. And if the logger doesn't, then TDEC can come out and shut the operation down. And so loggers are well trained in this. They don't want BMP violations. So don't ask them to do something that's questionable. Trust their judgment if they say that's not acceptable. So there are two types of logging jobs that I typically say. There's ugly ones and there's really ugly ones, but all logging is ugly. The problem is, as you study these photographs, please understand that neither one of these are logging. On the left is straight line wind. On the right is tornado. It's been estimated that in our state, roughly 2% of all forest land will go through a disturbance every year. And that can be wind damage, tornado damage, or harvesting, or for that matter, insects or fire. So 2%. So your forest has a 2% chance basically every year of going through some kind of a disturbance, which means 100% chance over 50 years if you were to extrapolate that. Now, natural disturbances, which is what you're looking at here, can be far more visually unpleasant than a timber sale, than timber harvest. And here's why. Consider that trees have been completely toppled, snapped, uprooted, the trails have been blocked, creeks have been plugged, views have been permanently changed and you had no say in this. So there was no forest management plan. It just, you woke up the next morning and here it is. I see it all the time. I get calls on this all the time. People saying, I wish I'd have sold my timber, because when you try to sell your timber after something like this, you can expect at best about 50% on the dollar, at best, probably more like 25%. You're going to lose a lot of money on those trees. And if you don't have a depletion basis, a tax basis, you can really get clobbered. Plus, remember that natural disturbances occur with no warning and no revenue has been generated. But with a timber harvest, I like to call that a controlled tornado. So yeah, it can maybe sometimes look like a tornado, but at least we have some control over it, because a timber sale is controlled because a forester was used. Trees have been paid for with a signed contract. Owners are prepared. You're ready for it. You can make requests about fences to protect and lanes and fields and creeks and vistas, etc. Timing, you've coordinated it with your schedule, with your retirement, or with the payment of a house that you want to pay off, or child going to college or whatever. You can time it. And then also you have a say, the landowner has a say on which trees are to be cut. And in a windstorm or tornado, certainly you have no control over that process. So I encourage you, after a timber harvest, if you, I've recently written a publication called Overcoming the Timber Harvest Blues. And you can Google that if you want to and find it and read about it, Overcoming the Timber Harvest Blues. I encourage landowners to invest back in your land. Take a percentage of your revenue and put it back. If somebody else grew those trees for you, now it's your time to invest back in your forest land. And a number of things you can do: timber stand improvements. So you might actually girdle some unwanted trees. This happens to be a black gum that didn't meet the landowner's objectives, and it was double girdled. Sometimes you can single girdle and apply herbicide to the ring, or you've heard of hack and squirt that can do the same thing. And this is eligible for cost share assistance from the federal and state government. So it's a good practice. Here's another example of actually felling some trees that were left remaining in an opening. So these are trees that were undesirable, and rather than allowing those trees to continue growing and bush out and shade the opening, well, they were cut down and treated. Sometimes wildlife managers call this hinge cutting. These look like pretty heavy hinge cuts. Those trees are going to die, but sometimes you barely hinge them, and the foliage, the leaves will continue to grow, which allows the deer something to reach. So, but that's a wildlife management practice. But you can invest back that way. Of course, you can invest back in tree planting. Normally, tree planting is done on open areas, though. When you try to plant back in these forest openings, it can be done, but what you're going to find is the natural regeneration just outgrows the seedlings that you're planting, unless you're willing to really go out there and spray herbicide and watch over them. Don't do it on a large scale, because it'll get out of hand in a hurry and you won't be able to keep up with it. But that's a possibility. But if you're going to do it, I would encourage you to use big seedlings. You might even consider underplanting before the harvesting, 2 or 3 years before the harvesting, to get them started. You can invest back also with growing some non-timber forest products like ginseng, maybe taking some of the byproducts and growing shiitake mushrooms. Get your family involved in it, the younger generation, and they have some buy-in, then they'll want to keep the forest forested. So those are just some examples. You may also want to lop your tops. Tree tops are ugly. They're temporary, so they really don't bother me, but you might want to cut them down along highly visible areas, along roads, maybe along trails. Just remember, though, that it can be dangerous cutting these tops, because sometimes they're under strain and they can snap back and do a great deal of bodily harm. But for the most part, I encourage you just to leave them. Logging residue provides habitat that benefits a whole host of mammals and reptiles and amphibians. It's a great place for maybe a bobcat to raise some young, certainly reptiles and so forth. So a lot of regeneration is going to start growing back. Of course, the log landing areas, they receive a lot of impact. So here we have one immediately after the logging, and then after it was reseeded, the very same site. So brown is down. It's something that's one of the things that people don't like about a logging operation, is exposed soil. So you might want to either plant your log landing areas and even your skid trails too. These are linear food plots. If you've planted the right thing, great place for deer hunting. You're going to have some damage to the residual trees. This is butt damage. The goal is not to eliminate all the butt damage. You can't drag big trees out of the woods selectively anyway and not damage some trees. But a conscientious logger will do a good job, as good as they can. So I've got an example of moderate, minor, moderate, and excessive. That tree in the right really just needs to be cut down. That's going to blow over and snap off anyway. So after a logging, sometimes you'll have problems with exotic invasives because that sunlight, even exotic invasives want. So here's an example of course, kudzu. That's the biggest problem. I encourage you to control this before you cut. If you've got kudzu, don't even consider harvesting, at least within about probably 150 foot reach of any existing kudzu, because it'll find its way in there. It's better to try to control it. There's cost share assistance for that. Another one that spreads is this Japan grass or microstesium. I guarantee it's in your woods already. And deer, wildlife typically don't like it. Of course, privet is becoming more and more common. This can be controlled in the winter months, basal bark application. We're seeing more and more, of course, of Bradford pear too, and the list goes on and on and on. So consider that, talk to your forester ahead of time to see what you can do to minimize the spread of exotic invasives. I'm going to let you read this next statement, because another reason why we harvest timber is this. Trees are very important to our state. It's what we're good at. It's what we do. We grow trees, we harvest them, we convert them to usable wood products, and then miraculously we grow more. Our land with its rolling hills and its mountain peaks and its impervious swamps is well suited for the production of this natural resource. I'd like to say that trees are to Tennessee as hogs are to Iowa, and as corn is to Illinois, and as lobsters are to Maine, and longhorn steers are to Texas, wheat is to Nebraska, and dairy cows are to Wisconsin. This is what we do. You've heard the adage that says, find something you're good at and stick to it. And we're good at this. And so I conclude kind of the way I started. As always, first seek a forester. And then one final slide. This very presentation is not only available in that publication that I mentioned early on, but on November 1st, it will be released on YouTube on this particular URL. During COVID, I developed a series of educational sessions for private landowners. I've got 21 on there on the Back Porch Forestry site on YouTube. And so everything from silviculture to why are my trees dying? So I encourage you to go to this URL, and you'll find all of them listed. Like I said, the one this evening won't be released until November 1st, but you can subscribe and be notified each time I release a new session.